Welcome, everyone, to my introduction to this week's podcast of Listening to America. Russ Eagle, my dear friend, and I talk about our recent cultural tour to Cuba. We spent 10 days in Cuba, and this wasn't a pop in, pop out to Havana sort of thing or get in a couple of old cars. We did the whole island. We flew into eastern Cuba. We went to Fidel's ranch, where his boyhood home. We went to his tomb in Santiago. We went to the Mankato barracks where the revolution began on July 26, 1953. We worked our way across the island. We went to one of Cuba's a number of national parks. We went to the Bay of Pigs, swam in the Bay of Pigs. I lectured about the Bay of Pigs. I performed as Theodore Roosevelt at San Juan Hill. That was a bit of a weird but lovely experience. We had a pig roast with a family that wanted to befriend us. We heard from a law professor who has a very different view of the Rough Riders than Theodore Roosevelt would, as you might expect. It was a great, fabulous, troubling, exciting, inspiring, dispiriting journey. Dispiriting to see these good and decent Cuban people suffering because of the embargo that has continued for 64 years for no good purpose. We went to a Bay of Pigs museum in Miami, which was very much against the Castro regime, pro-insurrectionist. And then we went to a Bay of Pigs museum at the Bay of Pigs, which was pro-Castro, pro-revolution, pro-Cuba. So we got yin and yang on all of that. Russ and Liz have been partners in our work for the last few years, friends for many more than that, and they were the host couple. Wayne Fairchild of Lewis and Clark Trail Adventures in Missoula, Montana, organized the trip. He loves Cuba, and this is his 9th, I think, trip to Cuba, my 2nd. We saw a makeshift baseball game out in a field on the highway, the road, let's call it, as we were moving towards Havana on a Sunday. We had beautiful meals. The people were so gracious and so friendly and so poor, so needy. I urge everyone who's listening to, first of all, read what I have written about the future of Cuba. It's in our newsletter for this week, the week of the 11th of March, but it also is on the website, ltamerica.org, and it'll be on Facebook and other social media. I'm also sending it to Jason Mieres, to the Attorney General, Cuban-American in Virginia, a good friend of mine. I'm sending it to Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida, now the Secretary of State, not a friend of mine, both somebody who is very able, of course. I'm sending a fan letter to Barack Obama, who went to Cuba in 2016 and gave a magnificent speech about healing the breach between the Cuban people and the American people. But he also talked power. He talked truth to power to Fidel Castro and to Raul, both of whom were there on that occasion. So this is my 2nd trip. I don't know when I will go back. It was an extraordinary, beautiful, amazing, exhausting, inspiring, and in some ways dispiriting trip because of the lingering impact of the Cold War, now that the wall in Berlin has been down for 35 years. I should warn you all that we put up our post about the Steinbeck trip, the Steinbeck retreat that will occur in Monterey and Salinas, California, the 21st through the 27th of September. You should sign up for that. This will be our 4th Steinbeck retreat, but this is the first one that we are actually hosting at the National Steinbeck Center in Salinas, so that's very exciting. I'll be giving a public talk on the Fisherman's Wharf in Monterey on the Thursday night of that trip, so that's exciting too. I've had a really fruitful relationship with the people there because of the Travels of Charlie tour that I made this last year. It's not over yet. I'm still writing about all of that. I'm working on annotations for the book Travels with Charlie. So many things are going on. I'm exhausted. Home, some trouble getting home. Flight canceled in Havana. Flight canceled in Miami. Scramble for a flight in Dallas. The tram system, which was the only way I could have made that flight, broke down. I got home finally, and my luggage was lost. Luggage didn't come for several more days, etc., etc. But hey, Who's complaining? It's all good. I got home. I'm back in the United States. We took a group to Cuba at a time when it had been labeled a terrorist sponsoring country, at a time when the American embargo makes it almost impossible, a time when you need special educational visas to get there, at a time when just making sure the bus every day had enough fuel in it to take us from point A to point B was a struggle. We did it, and people warned us this is not a good time. You probably shouldn't put people in any sort of situation which could move into disarray. The fact is, it all worked beautifully thanks to Wayne Fairchild, our outfitter, headquartered in Missoula, and thanks to Marlin, our local guide and translator and interpreter. And he literally would be calling ahead and saying, is this restaurant open tonight? Do you have enough staff? Do you have electricity? Is your food truck coming? And so on. And yet it was flawless from the point of view of the client. There was never a down moment. So I've written quite a bit about this at ltamerica.org. I'll be writing some more about it. If you agree with us and everyone on our trip, without a single exception, and our trip included people across the spectrum, probably no Bernie Sanders people on the one hand and probably no MAGA people on the other, but everything in between. So the full spectrum of what we used to consider the Democratic and Republican Party platforms, fiscal conservatives, social conservatives on the one hand, fiscal progressives and social liberals on the other. Everyone agreed at the end of the trip that the embargo needs to be lifted. And so if you agree, contact your delegation. They do listen. They do respond to the voice of the people. If the people spoke loudly enough, the embargo would be over. Most people are indifferent to what goes on in Cuba. It doesn't affect us. It's not part of our daily vocabulary. And frankly, we have bigger fish to fry at the moment in America. But it's important. So I love the trip. I hope you will join us on some of these cultural tours. They're absolutely splendid and satisfying. I just enjoy them, and I'm so honored that I get to lead them with Russ and Liz and with Wayne Fairchild and with Marlin and others. So let's go to the show. Russ and I talk about our 10-day cultural tour in Cuba.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. This is Russ Eagle. I'm your guest host this week. I'm here to speak with Clay about his recent cultural tour that he led in Cuba. I was fortunate enough to be a part of that. And Clay, I know it ended up taking you a couple of days to get home and a couple more days for your luggage, but we're back after a couple of amazing weeks.
10 full days in Cuba from one end of the island almost all the way to the other with a group of 24 guests and a local guide by the name of Marlin and our old friend, the outfitter, Wayne Fairchild of Missoula, Montana. And of course, Liz, your wife, was an important part of all of this too. So this was my second cultural tour of Cuba, and it was, by any account, I think one of the best cultural tours that we have led, Russ.
Certainly. Also one of the most unique, and one where you just came away really with a sense of awe at what it took people across Cuba and across the United States, the efforts it took to put this together. It was a day-to-day thing. Every day there was an effort to get fuel for the bus, to find restaurants that had electricity and that had food, and very unique compared to the other trips we've done.
I don't want to paint too desperate a picture of Cuba. The roads were open. There was a fair amount of gasoline available. Cars were pretty heavy in traffic, at least in Havana. We got good food everywhere we stopped. We had nice hotels. But as you said, our host Marlin would be calling ahead to the town we would be staying in and saying, this is the restaurant that we had thought of staying at. Do you have food? Do you have electricity? Is there any reason? Do you have enough staff? And so there had to be a little bit of scramble because there are shortages and there are rolling blackouts and then unscheduled electrical blackouts And fuel is a real problem. There are long lines at some of the fuel stations, and the country just isn't getting enough diesel to run the generation plants for the whole nation of 10 million people. So Marlin worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make sure it all went as smoothly as it did, and we had to be flexible. The first thing I said when we gathered in Miami was flexible patience. Flexible patience. And I have to say, our group was extraordinary in that regard. I heard no grumbling. There were very few frustrations.
Right, and I think you get acclimated to the situation there quickly. I mean, very early on, we were sitting in a restaurant at night or after dark, and it just went black. And it was only for a few seconds, but you can imagine the reaction even in the U.S. if that happens to you while you're out for dinner. But everybody just sat there calmly. The staff just was ready for it, lit a few candles, turned on some flashlights, and serviced the meal. Everything went uninterrupted. A few minutes later, the power flickered back on. Gotten used to dealing with it, and they do.
The restaurants and the hotels have generators. They're like the generators you can buy at a hardware store, Best Buy, and we would hear them in the background at some of the places that we went. But there was never a time when the amenities that we expected, 3 meals per day, the bus moving to the next site, people meeting us to lecture to us at San Juan Hill, there was never a moment when things didn't go smoothly. I mean, that's a lot of credit to Liz and you, but particularly to Wayne and to Marlin for making it happen under somewhat difficult circumstances. I don't want to suggest that people shouldn't visit Cuba. In fact, I urge everyone who's listening, if you have a chance to take a tour of Cuba, to do it. It worked out surprisingly well. But since it was your first time and my second, what are some of your impressions? What do you come away with from having spent 10 days, and not just in one place? We didn't just go to Havana. We crossed the island.
The thing that really came across to me, and this is a very broad generalization, and there are some outstanding exceptions to this that we'll talk about, I'm sure, before we're finished here. But it's just the way everything seemed to be viewed through the past. As we made our way from the eastern end of the island all the way to Havana, the guides, the docents, they would point out buildings and facilities, parks, farms, infrastructure. And it seemed like they were telling us this is what this used to be. This was what it was before the revolution, before Russia, after Obama, or before Trump. Everything was. There just didn't seem to be a great sense of the present or the future.
That's really well said. I think that's a great insight, Russ. Just to give people a little quick history. So the United States has had a complicated relationship with Cuba all the way back to the founding fathers. Jefferson wanted it. He wrote a famous letter to James Madison saying he wanted everything from the North Pole to the bottommost tip peninsula of Cuba, where he would erect a cairn that says ne plus ultra, thus far and no farther. That was what he called his empire for liberty. Several presidents attempted to buy Cuba. Then, of course, in 1898, the Rough Riders, the American Army, and Theodore Roosevelt's volunteer cavalry, the Rough Riders, liberated Cuba, let's say, in air quotes, from Spanish oppression. The United States has had an on-again, off-again occupation of Cuba ever since. The Platt Amendment of 1903 gave us the right to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever we thought that it was necessary for our security or for their national happiness. Then came the revolution in 1953 to 1959, led by Fidel Castro against the horrific Batista regime. Batista was a right-wing militarist, strongman propped up by the United States to protect American interests in sugar and the United Fruit Company and the banks and gambling and the mafia and so on. And with the coming of Castro, the successful revolution that ended in the last days of 1958 and the first days of 1959, Cuba moved slowly towards the USSR and to communism, and the United States slapped an embargo on Cuba in 1961, and that total trade embargo, which has crippled Cuba, lasted from 1961 until right now. It's still in effect, Russ.
I think they have just accepted this. We were treated very well. Everybody seemed happy to have us there. They went out of their way to do what they could for us. The feeling you get is that they do not care for the American government, but they had no problem whatsoever with Americans. And, they're not really hung up on their dislike of our government. I guess, for most of them, this has just been a way of life their entire life. They just go about their day subconsciously aware of this, but not fixated on it.
Everybody has what we call a side gig. Everyone is trying to scramble to find money. People are not paid by the government-funded jobs enough to survive. And there's runaway inflation, of course, and food shortages and shortages of everything else, including fuel. And so people have secondary and tertiary jobs, just picking up where they can to make ends meet. And so these are people that really hustle. And they're surprisingly friendly to the American people. They want our tourism. They would like a great deal more of it. And just to linger on one thing that you said about the coming of Barack Obama, I know a lot about that now because I've been reading about it ever since we got home. But we watched a video on the bus one day on a long bus journey of Obama's speech in Havana on March 26, 2016, so in the last year of his two-term presidency. And that speech really offered a kind of a thaw. He spoke truth to power. He criticized the Castro regime and asked for free and open elections and end of censorship, political parties, etc., the end of all human rights abuses. But he also said, this is time for a new dawn, a new era in U.S.-Cuban relations. And he said, I'm going to urge Congress to lift the embargo. He allowed remittances of sending money from the U.S. to relatives in Cuba. He wanted to open for more travel and cultural exchange, etc. And I think, I'm sure you felt the same way, Russ, when we watched that beautiful speech by Barack Obama. I couldn't disagree with a single sentence in it. At the end, you think, oh, all that hope that he announced in March of 2016, and then it was shattered a year later when the coming of President Trump, literally on day one, he reversed all of Obama's initiatives and shut the door again on Cuba. And I think the Cuban people are bewildered by that. They're used to the yo-yo effect of American policy, but they seem very bewildered that this moment came when they thought maybe the long nightmare was going to end, and then President Trump, for whatever reason, pushed it back into place and reinforced it.
It's really amazing how often you would hear a reference to the Obama speech. We were on one of our tours around Havana. We went by the cruise ship. It's somewhat up to date, but you can tell starting to show signs of disuse, I guess. They would say, when Obama was president, we would have 3,000 people a day come up here, now nothing. And you can see how an entire economy had sprouted around that, and now it's just gone back mostly to desertion.
So let me just give a sense of the itinerary. On February 24th, we landed on a commercial flight, American flight, at Holguin, which is in the eastern sector. And we went then, on our way to Santiago, we went to the ranch where Castro grew up. They stayed open for us. What we learned there, Russ, is that they hadn't had an American visitor for 3 full years. Everywhere we went, we felt that we were sort of not uniquely American, but unusually American, that the American tourism industry has dried up, and so much of the Cuban economy was dependent upon tourism. 3,000 visitors a day in Havana off cruise ships those people would be leaving a lot of money behind in Cuba.
Right, and I think our guest really affected them when they told us at the Castro Ranch, which, we were there just a couple hours after we got off the plane. And when they said, oh, you're the first Americans we've had in 3 years.
One of the most startling statistics we heard, Russ, is that Cuba now has to import most of its food. It's a very fertile island. It could feed itself. It could feed the entire Caribbean. But because of the embargo, and there is no access to industrial agriculture of any sort, food has to be imported for Cuba.
Right. I noticed that flying in. I took a video of the last 2 minutes of our approach. You can see the grid of agricultural fields similar to what you see in this country, except maybe only 1 out of 10 you could tell was actually plowed and planted. A lot of empty fields. All right, Clay, we do need to take a break now, but when we come back, I know we want to talk about some of the extraordinary people that we did meet, some people that are finding a way to push toward a future in Cuba. This is Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Listening to America. This is Russ Eagle, and I'm talking with Clay Jenkinson about his recent cultural tour in Cuba. Clay, one of the first things we did early in the trip is we visited San Juan Hill, and Theodore Roosevelt actually joined us. You want to talk about that?
So, yes, I performed as Theodore Roosevelt at San Juan Hill. We didn't charge up San Juan Hill, but we were there on a beautiful day. We did this at the surrender tree right at the base of the hill. So, as I think everyone knows, in 1898, the United States declared war on Spain. Theodore Roosevelt resigned his position as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he rounded up what he called a harem-scarum group of Rough Riders, Native Americans, cowboys from his Dakota time. He called it the most heterogeneous cavalry unit ever assembled, and they trained in San Antonio, and they embarked from Tampa, and they went to Cuba. And on July 1st, 1898, he had what he called his crowded hour when he pushed through the regular troops and led this charge on horseback up this hill. There were Spanish snipers with smokeless Mauser rifles shooting down. He said his men went down by like 9 pins. He said it was the greatest day of his life. Years later, he said that he would have left his wife's deathbed to go to Cuba. He said that his only regret was that he didn't receive a disfiguring and perhaps life-threatening wound. So he's insane, of course, but this was the making of Theodore Roosevelt. And so I dressed up. I put on my buckskin shirt, and I had a polka dot scarf and a hat and cowboy boots. And so I performed and took questions as Theodore Roosevelt. And it felt a little weird, I'll tell you that. I'm shy about this, about dressing up. I'm a very shy person at heart. I hate the elevator when I have to go down, and you might meet someone you're dressed up like Jefferson or Meriwether Lewis or John Wesley Powell, or in this case, Roosevelt. And then so I kind of hid in the back of the bus. And then you're there, and I'm talking about these things, and I'm sure you were as jarred as everyone else, Russ. And Roosevelt believes in the white man's burden. He believed that the Anglo-Saxon people were the class act of the world. He believed that the Cubans were incapable of self-government, at least in the short term, and that America had to enforce what he called the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, that we had to police the Central and South America and so on. So there are very no Cubans listening to this, but we're listening to this, and I felt I was cringing in character. It's a strange thing. It's one thing to perform like that if you're in Omaha or San Francisco, but to perform as Roosevelt with those sort of whites, I suppose you'd call them white imperialist, white supremacist views, it was a little jarring to me.
And you were joined, I guess followed would be the correct word, by a Cuban historian who presented things from a slightly different perspective.
He was great. His name was Raymond. We later had dinner with him at his house, which he has a small boutique hotel, professor of law. And he said many things. I'll just quickly summarize a couple of them. He said, first of all, the insurrection had been going on for a long time, and the insurrectionists were winning against Spain when the U.S. swept in and pretended that it alone had liberated the people of Cuba. The United States lingered in its occupation and did not invite Cuban nationals to the surrender, that only Spanish and American people, officers and diplomats were at the surrender. That he said basically we exchanged one colonial oppressor for another, that the United States has intervened in Cuba over and over again, and so on and so forth. And so his sense was that Americans misread this story pretty severely, and that in doing so we have erased the heroics of the actual Cuban people in achieving their own independence in 1898. So that was a really welcome response. I really enjoyed that. And our interpreter, he spoke only Spanish, our interpreter Marlin was able to line by line to translate for us. And I thought it was a really great point-counterpoint.
And as you mentioned, that same evening, we visited Raymond's house and had a really amazing meal. I lost track of how many courses we had.
Just about the time we were ready to leave, they brought out these giant fish. I mean, and when I say they brought out fish, the fish was in its entirety on the plate, eyes and mouth and all, and we were all full up by then.
This was not the only time we went into someone's home.
The next time was even more amazing, and that was Harlan. So let me just give the background to this. Wayne Fairchild, who does our Lewis and Clark work, he's a very close friend of yours and mine, and we absolutely depend upon him as our outfitter. And he's become fascinated by Cuba. He's been there 8 or 9 times now, and he's the one who found Marlin, this superb interpreter. But when he first got there, he went to San Juan Hill and was kind of looking around and wanted someone to show him around. And this man came forward and he chose him, Harlan. They've become friends. And Harlan lives in poverty. Their house was nearly destroyed by a hurricane about 8 years ago. And Wayne, on his journeys, takes things to Harlan to help restore the house. And so they've become good friends. And Wayne's generosity, Wayne's capacity to find people everywhere he goes and to befriend them in a really respectful way and to help them out in any way that he can is one of the most remarkable things that I've seen in my life and extremely moving. And so Harlan, who has been the beneficiary of this friendship with Wayne, wanted us all to come for dinner. And it wasn't just a dinner, was it?
No, it was not. In fact, Wayne first approached us in December, I think. This was not part of the agenda we had put together, the itinerary, and just told us that this family was just very anxious to do this for us. And they had a pig they were raising, and they wanted to slaughter and cook that pig for us while we were there. So I think they were up at 4 or 5 a.m. that morning, getting that pig on the fire. It was hand cranked all day. To appreciate that, you have to understand the heat and humidity. It was sort of like being in the South in July down there, especially the early part of the week. So a tremendous amount of effort and resources went into this. I guess our group to dine filled up their entire, I guess what you would call their front yard, their front patio. They had borrowed enough chairs and dinnerware and so forth to serve us all. And it goes without saying that was probably the best meal we had, certainly.
But then Wayne said, come on, I want to show you the house. And so we go in the house. And in Missoula, Montana, this would be regarded as a shack. It was clean and tidy, of course, but it was not anything that a typical American would regard as a home. And yet they had deep pride in what they had been able to do, and they have brought so much comfort to their lives, thanks in some part to our friend Wayne Fairchild. I was just terribly moved by this, Russ, because the boys were so happy to show us the room that they now had. And you just, I don't know how you felt this whole trip, but I felt, these should be our friends. What is our quarrel with the people of Cuba, and what is their quarrel with us? This is government and government. And B, the fact that we have imposed this ruinous embargo for 64 years and deeply impoverished the Cuban people. And I'm not pretending that there aren't problems with the Cuban government and the Castros and so on. But the fact that we've done this and driven a people into deep poverty is just so upsetting to me. I know it was to you too. And you just think, what can be done? What can be done? Well, it's not clear what can be done because the current president will be in power for 4 years, presumably, and his party may be longer, and they are dedicated to maintaining the embargo. In my opinion, and I've written about this, people can go to ltamerica.org. I've written a set of suggestions about the future, but it's the definition of madness that Einstein gave us, doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different result. We haven't been able to bring down the government in all that time. Think of it, the world's greatest superpower, the hegemon, has not been able to force a regime change. in this tiny island. And secondly, our second goal is if we can't change the government, we'll so make the people so suffer that they will rise up and overthrow that government. And we haven't been able to do that either. In fact, we've tightened the control of the Castro regime because people who are being oppressed by an outside colossus are going to rally to their own government. So I just can't understand it, and I know you can't either.
No, there was no evidence that we came across that that any progress was being made, especially on that second point. And, we were a group of Americans down there with a group of Cubans, both sides outside of our government. And it was just amazing, the way we got along, the way we were able to communicate, the positive vibes, the description you were just talking about at Harlan's house. At the end of the evening, this family got together and sang traditional Cuban songs to us. But one of the highlights of the night was that Wayne was able to pull some strings and actually have some ice cream delivered.
I should say before we go on that we were all encouraged by Wayne before we embarked to Cuba to bring small items, toiletries, toothpaste, toothbrushes, individual soaps, shampoo, feminine hygiene products, pens, pencils, etc., because the Cuban people are just so desperate. The stores are largely empty, and that they would so appreciate just small gifts of things. And when we were at the Castro Ranch on the first day, we loaded up this poor director with his whole body was covered with this stuff we gave him, and we were handing it out to people who obviously needed it all the way along. And so to think that people that live that close to the bone, where an individual bar of soap is a really important thing, that then they would reach out and throw this huge festival meal for us. We paid for it, but you wouldn't see that in the United States. You wouldn't see that anywhere I've ever been. That's a special quality of the Cuban people, and I suppose it owes most to Wayne's relationship with Harlan.
Can't help but mention, we were in some fairly poor and squalid areas, but people in our group went out at night after dark in small groups. Some people as individuals, nobody ever felt threatened. Nobody ever felt like they were in any danger. In that sense, just a great place to visit.
I should say, just as we do this, that we started on the East Coast, Santiago, 3 nights there. Then we stayed in Camagüey 1 night, which is still in eastern Cuba, in Trinidad a 2nd night, in the Bay of Pigs at my special request for a night, and then 3 nights in Havana at the close. So we covered about 550 miles west to east, and then about double that in all the side trips that we made.
And I know that one of the things you like to do on these trips is sort of afford people the chance to view things from multiple perspectives. You mentioned the Bay of Pigs, but we spent a couple of days in Miami first. And so we went to the Bay of Pigs Museum in Miami, and then a week later we were at the Bay of Pigs and the Bay of Pigs Museum in Cuba. So
it was an amazing thing, Russ, because there's a Bay of Pigs Museum in Little Havana in Miami, and of course it's very pro-expat point of view. It's some of the people that we met there were actually veterans of the 2506 Brigade that landed at the Bay of Pigs on the morning of April 17th, 1961, this great fiasco and debacle in the early Kennedy administration, where the United States was internationally humiliated when that insurrection failed miserably. And so we went to the Expats Museum in Little Havana, where Carlos, who was a veteran of the brigade, told the story, and we looked at those exhibits and a beautiful film about that. And then we went a week later, as you said, at the Bay of Pigs to a pro-Castro, pro-Revolution museum about the Bay of Pigs invasion. And of course, you get yin-yang, opposite perspectives. And Carlos and I have become friends. He sent me a text after we were there, and then he asked me to take some pictures at the museum in Cuba, because they're redoing their exhibits in their museum in Little Havana in Miami. And so he's agreed to do an interview one of these days. So we got to see those two perspectives. And one of the things I most wanted to do, the first time I went a few years ago, we spent an afternoon at the Bay of Pigs and had lunch there. And then we moved on to Havana. This time I said to Wayne, let's stay overnight. And we did. And we swam. We swam in the Bay of Pigs. It was a spectacular afternoon.
Prior to that, we also had the chance to visit a Cuban national park. I think it was called La Gran Piedra. Quite a hike, actually. I think someone said there were 459 steps up to the summit of the mountain.
It's like only Wayne can provide a Wendover Death March in Cuba. So it wasn't quite the Wendover Death March from our Lewis and Clark trips, but it was strenuous. Everyone got up it. Beautiful views, national park, and an old abandoned French coffee plantation that we visited there. So that was our sort of strenuous day. We also were following the revolution. Now we aren't, we're not Marxists and we're not pro-Castro or anything else, but I'm fascinated by the revolution. So we started on the East Coast and we went to Castro's tomb, which is very impressive, in Santiago. We went to his boyhood home, his ranch, as we have already mentioned. We went to the Mankato Barracks, where the revolution began on July 26, 1953. We went to a farm nearby where they had stored ammunition, and the bullet holes on the front of the farmhouse are still visible. And we worked our way across the island to Havana, where the revolution had succeeded on the last day of 1958. And so we followed that to a considerable degree. But then we also looked at the Bay of Pigs and America's attempt to undo Castro's regime, both from the Miami perspective and the local Cuban perspective. We did not, unfortunately, get to go to sites related to the Cuban Missile Crisis, though I talked somewhat about that too.
Right. We did visit the site of the Mankato Barracks. And we saw all the bullet holes, which are still in the facade. And I guess that's really the beginning of the revolution.
So, Russ, let me say this. You're a lover of baseball. We didn't get to see a baseball game. Well, we did, actually. We saw a kind of a scratch game out in the middle of nowhere. It was very interesting, wasn't it?
It was. Steve Jager was on the trip. He's a good friend of ours and a big baseball fan, as am I. And we'd sort of had our eye out. We'd seen there are lots of baseball fields, but we hadn't seen a game. And then on Sunday afternoon, as we were headed to Havana, really a perfect, the bus was able to just pull up. We were on a little rise, so we were sort of looking down. The bus driver stopped and let us watch a little of the game. I got some great video. You could tell there were some real athletes out there. You could tell they had cobbled together the best uniforms that they could, and they were having a great time. That was probably my favorite scene of the entire trip, in fact, and I got some great video.
Yeah, it says so. Uniform is almost a misnomer because there were scattered uniforms from all sorts of different teams. There was no single uniform. This is just bad old gloves, bad old balls and bats, crazy. Some people in no uniform, some people in different uniforms. But to watch an actual scratch amateur baseball game in the middle of Cuba was very exciting, and it kind of reminded me of what baseball once was before the commercialization of baseball.
Right. In fact, we saw an inning change, and when the pitcher recorded the last out, he dropped his glove on the mound, for the other pitcher to use, which that was before my time. But there are some old Major League Baseball videos of outfielders catching the third out and then just tossing their gloves behind them.
I should say that a man holding a horse went through right field during the inning that we watched too, which was fun.
Right. I've got that on video, so hopefully we can post that video.
Let's do it. So it really was very moving to see this go on. We didn't expect it. And the minute the bus driver saw it, Santiago was his name, he stopped the bus and we got to watch about 20 minutes.
It's time for another break, Clay, but two things hopefully we can talk about when we come back are classic cars and Ernest Hemingway.
Indeed.
This is Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Listening to America. This is Russ Eagle. I'm talking with Clay about our recent trip to Cuba. And Clay, one of the fun things we did, this was after we reached Havana, is we tooled around town in some classic cars.
So Wayne's a big car guy, and several of our guests were huge car lovers. And so Wayne arranged for us to go to a classic car refurbishing factory. And when I heard this, I rolled my eyes and thought, oh, God, really? We're going to, what? So we went. It turned out to be spectacular. The man who was the owner was a huge man, comic, had a great set of stories. He had met Obama in Washington, D.C. He's restored dozens of cars. They're spectacular. I mean, if you've ever seen a restored car where people have poured $25,000 or $30,000 into it in the United States, same end game, but at a fraction of the cost. And then as we left, we all got into these cars, about 10 different cars, and drove around Havana for a while, winding up at the Plaza de Revolucion, the great revolutionary plaza where Castro used to give these 4.5-hour orations, and 1 million people would stand all day to hear the great revolutionary Fidel Castro. And so that was a real highlight, and it was amazing, wasn't it, Russ? Because a couple of the car guys were like, I had a 48 Chevy just like that, except the fins were new. You got a lot of deep in the weeds car talk.
Yeah, we did. They do it at a fraction of the cost of what we do, but not a fraction of the effort. What they have to go through to get parts. Sometimes they have people bring them in their luggage, but as the guy explained to us, I can't get a windshield into a piece of luggage. And if he can't ship it from the United States, he may have it shipped to Mexico, to Guatemala, whatever. He has a long chain of events, which of course adds to the cost and to the time, so that it can take years. And we did see cars in all different phases of restoration.
Only in Havana do you see the cars that are completely restored. Elsewhere in the country, the cars exist, but they're seldom restored.
Right, and there was the colors are just fabulous too. At one point, I needed to run an errand that did not involve the group, and so Wayne, of course, said, "Well, I've got a car guy that can take you." And so he called Guillermo, and Guillermo came and picked us up with a friend, but he was adamant that I understand that this was not his car, that his car was in the body shop, and that his car was much nicer than the one we were riding in. He probably told me that 6 times during the trip. So, they take a lot of pride in their cars.
Because we were on an educational visa, we had to go to a couple of educational events. We had the Professor Ray, who told us the Cuban side of the Rough Riders story. We went to a beautiful dance performance in one of the communities, and going to the car refurbishing factory was educational. So we built in those things to qualify for the visa that we were permitted.
Right, and we met quite a few artists. Some of our guests actually purchased some pretty amazing artwork. And I think you mentioned earlier, we visited the coffee farmer on our day of hiking in the national park. So we saw a lot of people who, despite sort of being stuck in the past, but there are people who are just making incredible, inspiring efforts to move into the future. And, to me, that was probably the highlight of the trip, was meeting those people. We
should mention the trip to Hemingway's villa. So Ernest Hemingway lived about 30 years in Cuba. He built a little world for himself there. He bought a villa just 7 or 8 kilometers from Havana in 1939. And he stayed there off and on, but mostly on, from 1939 until 1960. And then on July 25th, 1960, he left Havana temporarily. His health had broken. The revolution had occurred. Although he was friendly with Fidel Castro, he sensed that trouble was coming, and he came back to the United States, but not permanently. He intended to go back. And as I think everyone knows, he committed suicide in 1961 in Sun Valley in Idaho, and so never went back. And one of the great things that Fidel Castro did was not confiscate it and turn it into a government bureau, which he could well have done. He decided to keep it as it was, to leave it just as if Hemingway had gone away and was about to come back. And so you can't go into it. And by the way, it needs an enormous amount of maintenance. But you can peer through the windows, and you really get a sense of Ernest Hemingway in Cuba, don't you?
It reminded me of visiting the Carl Sandburg house in North Carolina, in the sense that it's essentially left as it was when he last walked out the door. And so his books are there. I took a lot of pictures of his bookshelves, and, I've been putting them up on the big screen and zooming in on them, hoping at some point to discover that he secretly maintained a Steinbeck collection. I haven't found it yet.
That is so Russ, but I always like to look at, once the pandemic came, I love to look at the books behind people that are talking heads on MSNBC or CNN or Fox. And so the same thing. So Steinbeck knew of Hemingway, of course, and when Hemingway won the Nobel Prize for Literature, Steinbeck said, it's about time, it's overdue, he deserves that prize. They had a somewhat unfortunate encounter in New York, but that's another story.
Right, that was just, I think, a product of other people insisting that they meet when neither one of them really had any interest in meeting.
And too much alcohol on all sides.
Right. Right. And we took a cab one night to the Hotel Nacional. That was a whole different world.
Yeah, a grand mid-20th century hotel that the mafia used to hang out in, and the Kennedys would go down to, and Marilyn Monroe and Arthur Miller, and this was America's Las Vegas in the 1940s and 1950s. It was the playground, especially for people from New York and the Eastern Corridor of the United States. And so we were propping up this right-wing strongman Batista, who made sure that everything was good for American visitors, especially the wealthy and the privileged. And so that hotel is now owned by the government. I stayed there the last time with the last group, but now everything changes so fast. You have to be so flexible. This time we stayed in this really new hotel. Late colonial charm to the Hotel Nacional.
It is. And, in the hotel that we stayed, you talk about change. Wayne, who goes back and forth to Cuba all the time, he commented several times about you never know what you're going to encounter. For example, our hotel was owned by a European corporation, and I guess their finances run through that. So we were actually able to use American credit cards there, which we were told we would not be able to use anywhere in the country. And that was the only place we found where we could. So it's just, I think, constantly changing.
We went to a really extraordinary restaurant in the center of Old Havana that Barack Obama dined at when he was there in 2016, and the maitre d' came out and proudly told us and showed us pictures of himself with the Obamas.
That was the exception to all the other meals. That I felt like I was possibly in a French Quarter restaurant in New Orleans. The atmosphere was different. The food was different. The food was good all around, but it was just different. This gentleman was obviously a chef. And, the level of service. Some of our meals, we were there at least 3 hours. The meals were just strung out. This meal, we were in and out of there in probably an hour and 15 minutes. And that was our last meal. But that was unique to the entire 10 days. One other thing, Clay, that stood out for me, we were in, sort of a Caribbean paradise type setting. But you couldn't help but notice the trash that was all around. I mean, you talked about the little port there where Hemingway moored his boat. Just as the water lapped up against the docks, it was just, there was more trash than water. It was almost solid. And you saw people along the way. I saw twice people just throwing trash out of their window and, from a third or fourth floor. And there just doesn't seem to be any effort to curb that.
Yes, I'm always troubled by that too. And so when I've been previously, I went through the Panama Canal twice, and we would stop in Nicaragua or Honduras or whatever. You'd see trash everywhere, and it seems you just want to say, why don't they handle this? But then when I started to inquire about it, I sort of learned some important truths. For example, it takes a pretty considerable tax base to have proper landfills, and trash pickup, that this doesn't just happen. This isn't something you can do yourself. And so if no one's coming through every week or every month to pick up the trash, what are you going to do with your trash? You don't have vehicles, so they can't just take it, to the landfill as you might do in North Carolina or I in North Dakota. So eventually people just start throwing trash in a heap. And then the dogs get in it and wild animals, and it gets strewn around. And as things get worse, it's sort of the graffiti on the windows story, or the broken window concept. As things get worse, people just start tossing it. And so it's not as bad in Cuba by far as it was when I was in Cairo or in other places in Central America. It's on the whole pretty good in Cuba. And of course, there are plenty of places in the U.S. where there's a trash problem too. But it is disconcerting. But then when you realize there's no infrastructure to collect that trash, at least it makes sense, doesn't it?
It does. I did see one lady, this was in Havana, came to her front door and noticed trash that had been tossed in front of her door. But she just went out and started kicking it across the road and kicked it to the other side of the road, which, hardly alleviates the problem.
I didn't see trash bins,
No.
So there's no place to put it.
Right. Yeah. You had to, even, in the nicer hotels, you had to look for one. So, they did not make it convenient.
We did not go to a cigar factory. The last time I was there, we went to a factory in Havana with more than 200 people rolling cigars by hand, terribly hot, fans that couldn't cool it. It just felt voyeuristic. It felt colonialist to go in and, gawk at people who are hand rolling these cigars for about $1 a day. And then afterwards, some of the alpha males went out and bought $500 of cigars at the shop right outside. And I just thought that was not right. And I felt a little that way when we went to the car refurbishing place, but I changed my mind almost immediately because of the personality of our host. But, you don't want to be first world people raising their eyebrows and shaking their head at second and third world people. That's an entirely inappropriate thing. It's hard not to do, but we have to check ourselves in it and realize that there's a reason for everything. And just imagine, Russ, if we lifted the embargo and suddenly there was modest annual investment, the banks reopened, the stores partly refilled, trash pickup occurred, and trash is not a big issue in Cuba. The restaurants could reopen. Just imagine what would happen if there were something like a semi-vibrant Caribbean economy in Cuba. It would be a world of difference, and that difference would come about pretty quickly.
Right. I mean, I think you would be able to, almost watch it happen. It would take place so quickly. We're running out of time here, Clay, but I did want to ask you one last thing. I think we've spoken glowingly about the food and so forth, the efforts that the Cubans made to feed us, the quality of the food, but it still was not American food, and it was a jolt to us. And
there's a sameness and a blandness to the diet, I think.
Right, and a lot of pork,
a lot of pork steak.
So I think all of us were looking forward to that first meal back. So I just wanted to ask you, once you were back on American soil, what was your first meal?
Oh, you too then. So I got stuck in Miami. So our flight was canceled in Havana. We got on the second flight. By the time I got to Miami, I couldn't get my second and third flights to Dallas and Bismarck. So I stayed overnight at a Red Roof Inn. So did Wayne. And so we decided to go out for dinner. And I said, I leave this up to you, Wayne. Whatever you choose, I'll meet you in the lobby. So I got in the lobby and said, I found the greatest steakhouse. It's only 4 miles away. So we went there. It was a Morton Steakhouse. And so, that's a very high-end American steak place. And we had beautiful fillets and great au gratin potatoes and gin and tonic and Pinot Noir and beautiful salads and great loaf of bread and so on. And I felt like joyful and ashamed at the same time. The minute I got to America, I went and got myself a big, juicy American-style steak. And I heard you, I think, several times on the trip say the word cheeseburger.
Right. I don't eat that many burgers, but for some reason I became fixated on it. So we did have a burger and fries at Nathan's in the Miami airport. But then once I landed in Charlotte later that evening, had a second burger at more of a gourmet burger place in Charlotte. So actually, my first two meals were indeed cheeseburgers.
I know it feels a little like, oh, there those Americans go again, but I was really hungry for a good steak, and we had it, and then I came home and fixed myself a couple of meals at home along the same lines. I made tacos one night and a cheeseburger the next night, and I've kind of gotten that out of my system now. But I don't have any criticism of the food in Cuba. It was excellent, but there's a certain sameness: beans, rice, pork. Beans, rice, shredded beef, beans, rice, chicken. And you get used to that, but it doesn't give you the kind of splendid variety that we just take for granted in the U.S.
Exactly. Lots of plantains as well.
Great salads, though. Beautiful tomatoes, all good. It was a great trip. I think it was one of our most successful cultural tours. And we gave a quiz at the beginning and at the end based on what Fidel Castro said at his famous trial. The trial occurred on October 16th, 1953 in Havana. And at the end, he gave this speech and he said, "History will absolve me." And the question I asked was, has history absolved him? How do we feel about Cuba and the revolution and the government of Cuba and what we should do about Cuba? And minds were changed. These are anonymous, these quizzes. Minds were changed, and almost everyone said, above all, we should find a way, at least gradually, to lift the embargo.
Yes, I don't see how you could make this trip and not come away feeling that way. We're out of time here, Clay. I know we could talk about this for hours, and I know it's going to continue to come up in the months ahead. And I know you've written about it and will continue to write about it on the website, so encourage people to go there.
I should say, Russ, before we close, that we're now posting our next big cultural tour, which is John Steinbeck in the Monterey Peninsula at the end of September. What are the dates?
The dates are September 21st through 27th. And there's information. I think it went up just recently on the website, but you'll hear more. But this is really we've got some special things on this trip.
We're going to have dinner at Steinbeck's house. We're going to be talking about Travel to Charlie 50 feet away from his rig. We'll be at Doc's Lab to talk about your favorite book, Cannery Row. We'll be going to Fremont Peak, where the last scene in the original version of Travel to Charlie. We'll go to his grave, of course, in Salinas, and we're headquartering at the National Steinbeck Center in Salinas, California. It's going to be the best, I think, of our Steinbeck retreats, and I just urge everyone who's interested in our tours or in John Steinbeck or both to sign up for this one.
Yeah, it's going to fill up fast, so if you're interested, go to ltamerica.org. Everything's there that you need to know.
Thanks to you, and thanks to Liz for all the coordination you do on these trips. It was great. One of my joys in this was to take you and Liz, to get you and Liz to Cuba, to see it. I think it's a life-changing experience, and I was so fascinated to see it through the eyes of all of our guests, but particularly through the eyes of you and Liz. So thank you, and we'll look forward to Steinbeck, the annual Lewis and Clark trips, next year to Jefferson's France, and so on. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America.